Jonathan, thanks for coming on.
Yes, right. Thank you for having me.
How are
Sorry, we were
you?
just talking. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining.
Yes, of course. So we were just talking about sorry, I was like in mid-story here and then we started recording. So I was telling you about the oh yeah, I was telling you about my house, right?
Hmm.
Telling you about my house. Yeah, yeah. And so right, so I moved into this house. Oh, right, because you asked me about the door in the show.
Right. Well, we just got started because of the door. So your show, we wanted to
Right,
do
right,
a.
right.
I'm so glad we're doing this. This is
We came
part
back.
two. We came
Yeah.
back. We're doing a part two because of the occasion of your show at James Fuentes, which just went up last week, and I really enjoyed the show. And one thing I noticed right away was that the door going into the space was not the normal gallery door. You go
Right.
in and it's like a scuffed up small little white door, and you're just kind of like, "What? This is weird. What's this?" And I thought about it later, and I didn't realize really what it was, that it was your studio door, until the friend of mine who installed the door asked me if I had been to your show, and I was like, "Yeah, it's great." And he's like, "Yeah, I did the door," and I was like, "Oh, the door." And you were asking me before that if I knew somebody that could install a door, and then
Oh,
I didn't
right.
realize
Right.
that was why. So
That was
maybe
why.
we could talk about the door.
Right, exactly. So yes, this is that's funny. I remember that now. Because it was a whirlwind for me, the store. But yeah, it has to do with my house, and it has to do with my studio. Or that's where I got the thought of the door, the idea for the door. I had the idea a really long time ago. But anyway, I moved into this house and I have my studio and it's got nice it's just a room in a house, it's nothing really special, but it's a little bit bigger, maybe than some rooms in some houses, but it's nowhere near the size of like, you know, Jackson Pollock's studio or someone like that. But it's a nice studio. The dimensions are very nice. Anyway, it's an old house though. It's from like 1910. And so nothing is a standard size on it. The windows and doors are all, unusual. At least nowadays, they wouldn't be considered standard sizes. I'm not sure if they even had, to what degree they even had standard sizes back then. But the doors are a lot taller. They're pretty narrow. They're pretty much normal width, but they're a lot taller than a standard size door. And they're all different sizes too. So anyway, the door to my studio though, it just had a really cheap, like mass-produced, really regular, basic, like very low quality, like laminate hollow core door, like from Home Depot, the cheapest possible, like regular interior door you could get, and that was the door to my studio. But it was there was this giant space above the door because the original cutout, was so much taller than this Home Depot door, and so that's just how it was. And then eventually I got a door made from like a Mennonite guy up where I grew up. It wasn't very expensive, but he made like a solid wood door to fit the cutout for a lot of the interior doors in my house. So then I took this old Home Depot door off the studio, and it got a little bit scuffed and marked and stuff because it had been my door to my studio, a little bit of stuff on it. Not bad, but some got kind of dirty and some paint and stuff. And I took it off, and I don't know really. And I saved it, because I liked it, I saved it. I just liked it, as an object. I liked the door. And I put it in my basement. And I had this idea that if I had a show, I would like to um, install that door as the way to get into the show. And I don't really know where I that idea really came from exactly, but I had this idea a really long time, like many years ago. It's been at least I've been in this house 10 years, so it's been maybe 5 years, 8 years ago, something like that. I had this idea. Um, but so that's what that door is. And yeah, yeah, and so and James was on board with it. But it was an issue just behind the scenes. It was a real issue, like getting it was difficult to get it done because we're thinking, oh, we have a contractor just build it in. But then, of course, it's like a ship in a bottle, and the paintings are way too big to fit through that door. My paintings are, and a lot of the paintings that the gallery shows would be too big to fit through it. So then it would be a problem because they need to access like the viewing room in the back, and I would have sealed it off so nothing could move. through the duration of my show. So it was starting to look kind of bleak, because it was like, well, we would need basically a door within a door. Like the whole original cutout in the Fuentes space would have to itself be a door, somehow that could be moved and to get paintings through, and then with my little door in that door. And it just seemed kind of complicated, and it started to seem kind of hopeless. So I just texted, and no normal contractor could do that. The people the gallery were getting in touch with. So I was like, well, maybe there's an artist. Seems like a thing for an artist, And I just texted everyone I knew, which was you. I texted you. I sent the same text I sent you, but I don't know that many people, and I haven't had my phone for that long. I just don't have that many contacts, so I probably only sent it to like 10 people. And it just wasn't looking too promising. And then I got a text back from an unknown number saying, "Oh, I heard you need a door, at Puentes." And I called the guy, and it was Jerry, your friend. And yeah, and he was like, "No problem." He's like, I was like, "We kind of need it done like tomorrow." And he's like, "Well, I like a challenge, and no problem." And it was just kind of unbelievable, like the,
And
the
he did it.
luck, the luck. And
Amazing.
he did it. He did it
Yeah.
in like a day. A complete total
So this is like a
stranger.
door in a door. The whole wall is basically
Yeah,
a
he
door.
built the whole insert. He built the whole insert. He went and measured. He built the whole thing off site. And he built like an insert that plugs the original like 10-foot opening into the gallery. He built that, and it's on wheels, and it's got hinges, and it's clever how it works. And then inside that is my door, and he built that whole thing. And he just showed up with it, and it worked perfectly.
Amazing.
Yeah, well, it really was amazing because I never met him before that. And I was telling him that he was like the who's the guy in Pulp Fiction? Harvey Keitel. He's like
Yeah.
the Harvey Keitel
Yeah.
character, right? That's exactly what it's like. But I just, it's something that it's a problem. It's kind of an interesting problem, to me, because you have the paintings, and the paintings to me are really the main. I mean, that's what's important is the paintings, and that's what I spend all my time on. That's what I think about,
But it
you
seems like
know.
context is really important as well to you.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is that you make the painting. Well, that's kind of what there is to talk about, I think, actually, because for this part too, because um, the painting is the thing that you think about. You're in the studio, you're making the painting, right? But everything, um, everything, any kind of object, or any kind of idea, um, is is not separable from its context. Anything. And a painting is like that too. And so the context is part of what something is. The context of a thing is actually part of what that thing is. Um, and it's kind of interesting with a painting because you put so much into it, almost like a black hole or something. Everything goes into it. Your energy and time and focus. But while you're doing that, you're part of a context. You yourself are part of a context, the room, the stuff outside your room, your history, the history of painting, other paintings you've seen. And a lot of that is stuff you're not aware of. So for me, when I go to a exhibition, and I'm interested in painting, so I guess I'm thinking mostly of painting exhibitions, but any kind of exhibition, it really makes a difference. The installation of the show really makes a difference, the presentation of it. And I've seen some very good paintings uh in shows that just the show is just not doing justice to the paintings. I mean, I think that the show and the installation of the show has to um take the paintings seriously enough that the art from the paintings extends out from the paintings to include the show itself, the show as an idea and literally the room. You know what I mean? And literally the room. So you could have really good paintings, but if you just put them on the wall, lined up on the wall, um, they will, even if they will still be good paintings, but they will that that context affects the art, and it becomes part of it. And a lot of that context, if you're not intentional about it, will have to do with things like the marketplace, that kind of come from the culture. You know what I mean? Those ideas are going to come from the culture and they're going to fill that space up.
rather than
And
from the painting.
that's right. And a lot of times it's kind of like a used car lot, but it's paintings instead of used cars. And so and so it's just something it's a really interesting problem for me because it's not something you can practice or work on, unless you have a show, which doesn't, for me, doesn't happen that often. You can't do it yourself. You can't have a show yourself. You have to work with someone else. You have to have a space. You have to have a context. You have to have a context. So you can't practice having a context without having the context. So it's kind of like, it's difficult. And so I've always, but I've had 4 solo shows, and all of them I've thought a lot about this, and I think I've had varying degrees of success. Honestly, looking back, I think some more successful than others with that, but it's something that is a problem that I've really tried to tackle. And I think it's really important. You know what I mean?
Just in terms of context in your show, I really especially thought about the context because you have two seemingly disparate bodies of work in the same
Right.
space. You have the
Right.
landscapes and then you have the abstract paintings. And that really changes the context of both. I think in a way that is it's clearly intentional, but it's very interesting because I'm really noticing things because of I guess the binary quality or the duality
Mm,
of each.
mm. Yeah. And that's often how that's been part of my work. Really since I got to New York and I got out of grad school and started, it's just for whatever reason, it's what I've needed to be able to make work. Early on, I needed to really accept or make peace with th- the idea that I wasn't going to really value the idea of style. The idea of style was just not going to be a big thing for me. It was not going to be something that I was going to be able um, to use. It just didn't matter to me. I mean, I guess I kind of had, for me, I kind of had to radically put the paintings first in the process of making the paintings. I kind of had to radically put that first, and I had to really abandon what I sort of came to see as like the illusion of like control over it, or myself. I had to get myself. Um, I had to not see it or not think of it or not have it be an extension of myself in any kind of way. It had to come from the work itself, which is embedded in a context, which ultimately is like the world. And I had to just kind of like participate in that context, kind of like along with the world. And what's interesting, I think, the hope I think for, is that of course, you're part of the world and you're participating in generating it. You're participating in generating the world too, like from within that context. But it's not about me saying this is the way it is or this is the way it's supposed to look or something like that. It's just not. So, and I think it's been really interesting and I think it's been really productive and it's been sustainable and it's something that I can develop and continue to learn from. But what it does mean is that my paintings don't necessarily end up all looking similar. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And there's a bunch of different kinds and there's a bunch of different approaches to paintings that I'm willing to try. If it seems like I should, then I will. Or if I'll have a reason to do it, then I'm going to do it. And so you end up with these paintings that are stylistically disparate, and so that's something that I've tried to use, starting with my first show. I try to use the idea of putting these paintings together, hoping that in the hope that somehow the art can flow out from each painting. Each painting is like distinct in and of itself. The distinctness of each painting, like without regard to style in and of itself, will hopefully create a space around it, and then interact with the space in between the paintings, starting from each painting as it's kind of like its own thing. Each painting is enough its own thing because style is really abstract. Style is like the way something looks, regardless of which thing we're looking at. Does that make sense? Like a signature style, it's like an image you could have in your head, like, oh, what does this guy's work look like, or that person's work? And you can kind of think about it, and that's just an idea that is in your head, and you don't actually need a painting. to have that idea. And so that idea of style can end up filling up all that space between the paintings. And I wanted the paintings themselves to fill up the space between the paintings and not these ideas. You know what I mean? Not these abstract ideas, which to me are very dull. And basically, and limited. Those ideas are very limited. You know what I mean? And they do kind of those kind of ideas to me do kind of end up having more to do with like just things that just don't interest me a whole lot. That I just don't think are that like productive to think about. Like asserting an identity for yourself,
And you
right?
might be
Or
also
making or
asserting or
making
making
money or making
a
money.
product. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's what's sort of refreshing about your show is that I came in thinking, sort of expecting I'll see Jonathan's abstract paintings that I know what they look like.
Oh,
There's like
really?
well, kind of there was reference to the frame.
Oh,
I
right.
kind of
Oh,
have
the
an idea of
stretcher.
what I'm,
Yeah,
yeah, the stretcher bar, and I kind of have
yeah,
no
yeah.
an idea of what I'm getting into, and then I show up, and then these landscapes, these little landscape paintings, they almost have an impressionist feel to
Hmm.
them and they're quite surprising. And talking to you about them really changed also the way I viewed them because I'm sort of getting a feel for the context in which those were made. And I guess so for people that haven't seen the show, basically there are two large abstract paintings that are sort of color field-esque, and if they know your work, they'll recognize these. And there's, I think, are there three other paintings? They're landscapes, small
Three
landscapes.
landscapes in the show. Yeah, I made six. There's three in the show though. Yeah.
They're about 3 by 3 feet. Is that right? Something like that.
Hmm. They are probably a little smaller than that. Yeah.
So, but kind of like small,
30, 27 to
mid
30-ish.
mid to
They're all a
small.
little different, but I would call them
You did these on
small-ish.
location, close to your house, in plein air, on site, right?
Well, yeah, what happened is it came out of they came out of just a need. I think it has to do with time, maybe a need to address time and I mean, time is always such an important part. We talked in part one. See, I can't, I love this idea that we have part one and now it's part two. But in part one, we talked about time like in relation to color. And time is always, it's a hard thing to grasp, but I know it's a big part of making paintings for me. And to me, it is why probably, or what's interesting about starting with color as I do. I think what's interesting about that to me is that to me, it's a way of addressing time or trying
Do you
to
think
address
some
time.
colors are quicker than others?
Uh, well, some literally are, yeah, because I mean, it depends on how you look at it, right? But it's an interesting thing because color is a perception. And so a lot of it has to do with your mentality, but or your point of view, right? Or your experience versus mine. Um, but in terms of like wavelengths and physics, like there are colors like on the spectrum, like on a rainbow or something. And I do like those kinds of colors, those kinds of like pure colors on the spectrum, like the electromagnetic spectrum, like visible light, I
Hmm.
like those kinds of colors. And those literally, um, yeah, some of them literally are quicker. Like violet's the fastest, and it has the shortest wavelength and the highest frequency, and red is the slowest, longest wavelength. Um, and if you got slower than red, it would just be heat. It would be infrared, which we can't see unless you have your those goggles on, like the army guys have, um, and like that. But yeah, I had a major storage issue. I had a show during COVID, and a lot of things came back from it. And I had all these boxes, and I had a lot of objects in the show. Speaking of which, trying to address the idea of the installation in a painting show, trying to address the installation as an artwork itself, coming from the paintings. But I had always made these kind of like objects off and on, when I just wanted to think about something, kind of maybe because I read something or whatever, and I kind of had never shown them, but I showed them in this show in 2021 along with the paintings. I thought it would be a good idea, but they came back and they're in all these big boxes, right? And the paintings too. And there's a lot of big paintings, and so my studio was just kind of um paralyzed by all this cardboard, cardboard. The art world has there's so much cardboard that goes around, a ton. And I couldn't even move in there, and I couldn't deal with the storage, and I didn't know really what to do. And so I just wrote instead. And and the mental state I was in, I just couldn't deal with it. And then I had all these thoughts and all, and I thought I would just spend some time just writing like the history of my like thinking about painting, and I tried to kind of like write a book actually. And that took a while, like maybe like almost a year. And then I was after that, and that's a lot of sitting, and that's sitting, it's very different from being in the studio. It's just sitting at the computer and like typing, all the time I would have spent in the studio because I had my schedule developed very carefully, built out so that I can have time to work, right? So that time went to writing instead. And it's just sitting there in a chair typing, and that's all it is. And so it's a very kind of like abstract activity compared to in the studio where you're in a room moving around, moving your body around, doing things. But I did that for so long, and then I was ready to tackle this storage issue and stuff, and I did, and I solved it by rolling up a bunch of paintings. And so I had these stretchers. From paintings I had rolled up. And there was this painting in my second show I had in 2014, and I rolled it up. And I liked that painting. And but the stretcher, had these crawl spaces and all on it, but I I I didn't know what to do with all these stretchers. So I cut it up with a saw. I cut the stretcher up with a saw, and I took what had been originally the four corners of the stretcher, and I just sliced those out. So I had four small stretchers, right? That I kind of cut out. Does that make sense? I
Hmm.
sliced them out, yeah. And so I had these four stretchers, and I stretched those up, and those were the first four landscape paintings that I did. And I did those sitting in my studio looking out the window. Um, there's a tree, out there, a couple trees. I have a magnolia tree, and my neighbor has a pin oak, and you can see his house. And I would just sit there quietly with the stretcher on my lap with the brush, looking. And it was really, really slow. And I don't really have um, I don't really have an academic training background really in painting. My first teacher was actually a still life painter. So I did learn that a little bit from him, but that was just one semester. I don't have that kind of a training. So it was I guess I don't know if I would say it was difficult, but it took me a long time because I'm looking and it's there's so much to see and it's really complicated. If you really look out the window, it's really complicated. And I'm so interested in color, and that's what I'm looking at. That's what's motivating me to look because I'm curious about the colors. And in the real world, the colors are very different. So, when I'm making my paintings, like I was just saying before, I'm interested in like the spectrum and like wavelengths of light and stuff and those types of like pure colors which I like and they're better for mixing and stuff. But the real world doesn't have a lot of those types of colors. It's got a lot of broken tones and grays and browns and a lot of earth tones and stuff like that. So it's really interesting for me to like check out those kinds of colors that I'm just not naturally drawn to, because I had to deal with it because it's there. And it's so interesting because, well, to me anyway, because you're looking, and I'm using the brush, right, for this. So it's really like you mentioned impressionist, but it was like that. It's like you look, you dip the brush, you mix up, okay, you look at it, you figure out the color, you make the color, you dip the brush in the paint, and then you try to put it on there as best you can, what you think would be appropriate given what you see, and then you do it again. And so it's just like back and forth like that, with the brush. And there's something, and I would never normally use a brush in that way, like using a brush as a brush. I would never, ever, ever, ever do that on like a big painting, ever, never. I would never do that. Because those are just not about that kind of like abstracted, like looking and representing, that the brush. I mean, there's so much history of painting, and a lot of it has to do with the brush. And so to me, it's like it's almost like inherently representational. It's very hard to separate to me the action of the brush, using the brush, like holding your hand, from the activity of like looking and rendering and representing. You know what I mean? And so I would never use it for a big painting, but so it was kind of fun or something, or kind of interesting actually, and nice to get a chance to do the brush. It's like, hey, I could use a brush too, you know. And
Did it feel slightly did it feel slightly devious?
very slightly naughty, yeah,
Is it a little
using the
devious? Yeah.
brush.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's
Well,
the
it's
thing.
just
I
not
think
something I would normally do, you know.
well, you have to watch that. You have to watch those areas where it's if it's something that you wouldn't normally do and you think, "Oh, this is ridiculous. This is just silly. I can't do that."
Do you
Should
do
I?
that?
There's an element of sort of mischievousness that is really healthy.
Well, there's a punk rock attitude that I definitely have, like in general, you know, for sure. Just as a person, but definitely in relation to painting. And I guess maybe that it's punk rock. They
Which
use a
is
brush.
interesting. It's like it's like an inversion.
Right, right,
You
right,
know, it's like, oh,
right,
I couldn't just paint a landscape, a tree out the window. That's ridiculous. Could
Yeah,
I?
yeah,
You know.
yeah. But you know, it's so funny because paint, you know, it's so. I was just looking at my paint the other day. I was making, you know, working on a big painting, and I was looking at the paint and the paint, just what the paint does. Like, look what the paint does, and it's just paint. And I've actually I do less with the paint now than I ever have before. You know, when I was younger, I would add solvent to it and splash it around, and you know, do different things like that. And I don't. I just have the paint I make. I make my own paint and that's it. I will never add anything to it anymore. And it's still so highly variable and so like unpredictable and it's just so fascinating, you know, but it's so interesting because there's like nothing to it. There's just nothing there. I guess that, and maybe that's why, because the materials have such a poverty with painting. There's such a poverty of materials. It's just like it's like mud on a surface. You know, there's just like it's like so close to just being nothing. You know what I mean? It's so close to just not being anything at all. And because of that, maybe because of that it can actually be anything, you know, and I'm still like kind of like amazed and shocked just to see like what the paint does, you know, and there's so many different ways to approach this nothing of making a painting. There's this like kind of like inherently like incredibly banal activity, you know, there's so many different ways to approach it, and I kind of feel like so curious, you know what I mean, so curious to try it, so I got to try this one with the brush. It was kind of amazing actually, you know.
The state of your consciousness should almost be part of the medium or something like that, you know, because it's so open.
You're totally right. You're completely see that statement is so completely and I was almost opening my mouth to say that exact same thing because you're so completely right. And that's one thing that is one thing that I really noticed doing the landscape paintings too, right? Because you're looking and painting and you can't do them simultaneously. And try it. You can't. You can do one thing at a time. You cannot look and paint at the same time. It's one or the other. So you can switch back and forth and you kind of trick yourself that you're doing it like in relation to each other. They're two totally different activities.
Oh yeah.
They almost have nothing to do with each other. You know what I mean? They have nothing to do with each other. We just pretend that they do. You know, if you're either looking or you're painting, you got to pick one. You got to pick one. You got to do one. If you're really going to look, then you got to only look. And if you're really going to paint, you're going to only paint. And so what I noticed is that okay, I'm painting quote unquote because of what I see, but after a while, it's unavoidable that what I'm seeing is being generated by my painting. The world is actually being created by me painting it, the
Yes.
world that I see. And I look at those scenes that I painted in landscapes, and they don't look the same ever again. They've been forever changed because of how I painted them. You know what I mean? I changed the reality. I created the world I mean, I generated that piece of the world by looking, you know, because of the painting process. Does that make sense? Like it comes from the world into the painting and the painting, but the painting creates the world at the same time. The two have to create each other. Neither process can be separated from the other one, is what I'm trying to say. Does
Oh
that make
yeah.
sense? Okay.
100%. Completely agree. I think
But
the action of consciousness, that's basically consciousness in microcosm creating itself.
yeah, so that's exactly, yeah, exactly right. And that kind of gets into the whole thing of like the mind body problem where which we brought up sort of briefly in part one, but it's like there's a network. There's like a physical um there's a network of physical objects. So okay, we're familiar with like from physics or even like not fancy physics, but basic high school physics, like Newtonian physics, there's a network of physical causality in which we're embedded in, where billiard balls bump into each other, and you know everything affects everything else, and the butterfly effect, and whatever. And you know, so because this happened, this physical thing happened, and this thing happened, and it has to do with potential energy and kinetic energy and whatever entropy, and it's all been mapped out, and it kind of makes like intuitive sense, right? But at the very same time, at the very same time, um, that same network of physical causality is that's interdependent and interlocking, and there's like nodes of it that you could focus on, but it's all one interconnected kind of system. It's a system, that's a mental system too, right? That's a mental system too. And so they're by the same token of there being this interconnected sort of web of physical causality, that same system is also an interconnected web of mental causality, you know, for sure. For us, because we're thinking subjects, and so there's no escaping from that, right? And so our perceptions of things and other things, perceptions of us, it's all at the same time that it's physical, it's also mental. The mental states are generating it just as much as the physical states.
Do you think that the mental states generate the physical states? Do you think that the consciousness generates physical reality?
I think that they're the same thing. And so, this is kind of like we can get into this actually if you want to, since it's part two, since we already had part one. But I think that we mentioned before, so that's like basically this is like mind body problem. We've got like mental states, thoughts, feelings, emotions, perspectives. And then we have physical, those are facts too, but then we have like physical facts, tables and chairs in our own bodies, our brains, things like that. And it seems clear that these two types of states have something to do with each other, right? They seem to affect each other. If the sun is bright and I look at it, it hurts my eyes. And so there seems to be some kind of a link. But they seem like they can seem to us to be like fundamentally different things. And then a lot of like the history of Western thought, they're assumed to be fundamentally different things. And I think that's because we wanted, or a lot of people have wanted, you know, to posit this sort of purely non-physical, we could call it mental, but purely non-physical like entity that's like the true essence of what you are, like a soul or something. And so then that when your body dies, that thing can just keep going, and that part of you doesn't die. And I think that was sort of probably largely a big part of the motivation for trying to keep those states separate, mental and physical.
I feel like this is leading up to Derek Parfit.
Look
This
out.
this whole conversation we've
Oh, it is.
been,
It
yeah.
is. It is. I'm sorry about that, but it is.
No,
Yeah.
I'm glad you sent. So you sent me before we
I sent
started
you
talking.
homework. I sent
You
you
sent me some
homework.
homework.
Has anyone ever sent you homework before?
No, and I appreciate it because I'd heard about Derek Parfit and I'd been meaning to read something. So you sent me an essay out called Personal Identity,
Yeah,
which he's
yeah.
basically refuting the idea of a stable and enduring self.
Right.
And when you talked earlier about your paintings, but basically like the main sort of idea or ideas behind your paintings, essentially to illustrate this fact that you rejected a style, a personal
Right,
style,
right, right. It's related to
because
that.
yeah,
Yeah, it
related to
is.
that.
Hmm.
And I appreciate that. Now I'm seeing your work differently. I see it in the way that you're very much trying to keep it open and not have it get bogged down in what people call a style.
Well, it's just that I don't pay attention to the style, So if you spend all your time assiduously avoiding style, that's a style too, right? That's a style too. And so I just don't think of it. I try to keep myself and the work embedded in basic essentially in reality. I try to keep myself and the work embedded in reality and let that reality generate the work. And what it looks like it's kind of just beside the point in a way to me. I mean, it ends up that's just how it ends up, right? It ends up looking like this, or it could end up looking like that. And in a way, that's kind of like none of my concern because that's the way reality made it.
So they're really just
That makes sense.
artifacts of a certain kind of engagement with reality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, yeah, Derek Parfit, yeah. And so, I kind of had this idea about the mind. So right, oh yeah, so mind body, yeah. So that's like dualism would be like Descartes,
Descartes, right.
keeping the mind
Mind,
and
body.
body
Uh-huh.
strictly separate, right? And it's unsat to me it's unsatisfying, but a lot of people think it's unsatisfying, and so people will try to, which we mentioned in part one, people will try to resolve it by saying, okay, well, everything that we think of as a mental state is actually, in principle, totally reducible to a physical state, you know, like neurotransmitters and particles, positions of particles like in the brain. And that would be like physicalism, that point of view. Or you could do the opposite and you could say, oh, well, you know, which people have, philosophers have done. You know, what we take to be reality and objects and stuff is all just exists in our mind, or some people would say in God's mind or something, and there's no such thing as a physical reality. So those are two ways out of it. You could deny you could get out of the mind body duality by just denying half of it. Say that well, there is no mind, it's only body, or there is no body, it's only mind. Those are the two directions. So get rid of it. But to me, those don't actually solve the dualism. They preserve it. They just move it into a hierarchy so that we still have the dualism, but we've just turned it into a hierarchy instead, right? And so to me, that's unsatisfying, right? Or you could say, well, there's a third thing that's not body or mind, and what we perceive as body is like one facet of this third thing. What we perceive as mind is a facet or an appearance of this third thing. That's called neutral monism. So that's instead of dualism, it's monism. It's one thing, but that thing is neutral. All to me, also very unsatisfying because, well, what is that third thing? It's like in principle not available to us. What we have is bodies and minds, and so why does it have to be this mysterious thing that I can never access? Like I want to, if there's reality, I want to experience it. I want to have it right now. You know what I mean? I don't want it to be some ethereal abstraction that like is in principle unattainable. You know what I mean? That's upsetting to me. And so what to me the answer is just to erase the distinction completely. Just erase the distinction completely between the mind and the body. So like for example, I was in college and I was walking down the street, you know, and I saw these daffodils. Um and and then I saw them again like the next day or a couple of days later, and my mood had really changed in between. Like I I was upset or I was sad or something the second time or the first time. And normally we would say, well, the daffodils have like persisted in like a stable, independent physical reality, but my like perspective on them has changed because of my mood changed. Um, but you know, thinking about like Kant, you know, the when we perceive, we can't really separate. I mean, the objects that we perceive can't really be separated from our apparatus for perceiving them. You know what I mean? And so when you perceive an object, you you can only ever perceive it according to the mechanisms and the functions, the abilities that you have, the capacities you have for perception. So is the question of what this object like actually might be, like in some kind of like a more objective sense, is kind of like unavailable to you because you're only ever able to see it according like through your own filter of the way that you perceive things, you know, according to the structures and mechanisms you have for perception. So you know you're perceiving things like the way that you can see them like to yourself. Then what the thing is like not available to you. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And so, you know, it doesn't mean that you're only perceiving yourself, but it means that, you know, the things that you perceive are kind of like co-created by the world and by your mechanism for perceiving them, right? But I think with Kant, you know, he's kind of assuming that so that's Kant, you know, and he's resolving, he's doing that to resolve the distinction between um you know, like rationalism and empiricism. It's like an epistemological crisis that he's trying to resolve. But I'd look at it more like metaphysically and not just epistemologically. But with Kant, he's sort of assuming that we're all kind of the same in a certain sense. Like we all have some kind of similar apparatus for perception, you know, and our brains kind of work more or less the same way, and that we're stable too over time, that each individual person is pretty much stable over time. And I guess what I added to that, I think without really thinking about it, was like the Derek Parfit thing, like I sent to you, you know, and so like, what if, I mean, what it seems to me that like, yeah, that's true, that when I perceive daffodils, I'm perceiving my own capacity for perceiving them. So I'm only seeing like my version of the daffodils, right? But who's to say that my version of the daffodils is the same today as it was yesterday? Because I'm different. I've changed. I've changed. I'm not the same person. And who's to say that it's the same for you, right? So it just makes reality much less like stable than Kant would say, because anything that can perceive, anything that can perceive is constantly like in flux, and what matters is like you're like for continuity over time is like just your psychological continuity, but that can change. You can lose your psychological continuity, you know, and so it's silly to even speak of yourself as the same person as you were before if you there's a break in your psychological continuity. Does that make sense?
I confess that I did ask for a summary from ChatGPT about that article. And
Yeah, I don't blame you.
I read a bit of the article, and I'm
Well,
like, whoa, 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 this
I
is,
gave you like an hour and a
yeah, I
half,
need
so
more time for that. So the one sentence they say, they, as in ChatGPT,
oh
says
yeah,
that
yeah.
Parfit's key claim is that personal identity is not a deep, all or nothing fact. What really matters is the continuity of our psychological life.
Right.
Do you think that's
Um,
accurate?
yes. I think his argument is really hard to refute. It's a really good argument, I think. It's a beautiful argument, and it's surprising. But the idea is that he thinks we would be better off just ditching the concept of personal identity, of an independently existing self that's stable over time. We should throw it away.
Serious meditators have come to that conclusion that there is no
Yeah,
deeper
yeah.
self.
It's interesting. It does relate to a lot of Eastern, religious ideas, I think. It's interesting. If he mentions, I think he might mention it actually in the article.
It seems to be true. I mean, if you look into it, try and find the self. You can't.
Um, yeah, and it's just funny too because he in the article he's such an old school like Western style philosopher. He's in like oh I forget King's College in England, but so he does these like thought experiments, very like and it's like it's interesting because there are questions where the question of like would I survive doesn't actually have an answer. You know what I mean? And
Oh, with
so,
the two brains in
yeah, the
or
two brains
if
thing.
you
Yeah,
were
cut your brain in
separated, yeah,
half. Yeah,
and you
put
were in
half
two
your brain
bodies.
in two different bodies. Yeah. But in principle, it's possible, but it almost doesn't matter that if it's physically possible or not, but it turns out it probably is. But yeah, the question of whether or not you survive is actually not important in just the same way that we don't assume that the question like is it the same nation or is it the same machine or is it the same boat, like the ship of Theseus, we don't assume it has to have an answer. And persons are like that too, because survival can be like a matter of degree. It's not necessarily an all or nothing thing, but identity is very absolute. Identity is a very black and white relation. It's a one-to-one relation. It's all or nothing. You either survive or you don't. But actually there are cases where survival is a matter of degree, which violates the identity principle. So we have to ditch identity then. Um, so yeah, so I guess I kind of combined that idea about personal identity with Kant, and I came to the conclusion that it's safe to say that the daffodils are actually distinct, different daffodils, because as insofar as they represent my mental objects, like I'm a subject and I'm looking at them and my mentality has changed. And so what the daffodils represent to me has changed from my perspective. And so it's safe to say that these are new daffodils. And I think that any of our physical objects that we behold are also our mental objects. But I think that the next step there is to realize that um, those physical objects that we regard as mental objects for ourselves are themselves also mental subjects looking back at us. Because what are we? What are we? If we're subjects, we're subjects beholding these mental objects and treating them as our mental objects, these physical objects that are also our mental objects. What are we? We're also physical objects. Who's beholding us? Some other object. And who's to say on what basis are we denying some kind of mentality? It doesn't have to be the same mentality as us, but on what basis are we denying some kind of mentality to what we assume are just physical objects like daffodils or rocks? On what basis do we deny mentality to them? Because if we are able to somehow make the jump from physical matter to having points of view and mental perspectives, that's just a jump from physicality to mentality. And why can't anything that's physical make that same jump? On what grounds can't it? You know what I mean? So let's say, could you have to have a brain? Well, what about a whale brain? Well, that seems like it's also good enough to have a point of view, right? What about a mouse brain? What's lower down than a mouse?
And those are just the obvious ones.
What about what's lower down than what about a bacteria? Does that not have a point? Doesn't it have a structure? Doesn't it have a cellular structure, an organelle that would function as a brain? You know what I mean? And who's to say? So who's to say? So the point is that there's physical structures that act like quote unquote like brains. And where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? Because you can keep going down more and more quote unquote primitive. But the point of the bottom line here is that you have physical substance that's generating mentality, and where can I draw the line and say, well, these kind of physical substances can do it, but these ones can't. If a physical substance can generate mentality, any physical substance can generate mentality. So you have to treat them all as subjects. Any physical object, we have to treat it as a subject. And if you don't do that, you say, okay, I am the subject, and everything that I regard is my object. You've abstracted yourself from reality. If you say that, you've abstracted yourself from the world. And where did you come from? Where'd you come from? You had to come from the world. Where'd you come from? You had to come from someplace. You can't come from nothing. So you're either part of the world or you're not. But if you say that, you're saying you're not part of the world. So then where'd you come from? You had to come from the world. So you have to be part of it. So you have to accept that you are embedded in that same mental, physical causality that everything is, and that everything's the same as you on some level, even if you can't relate to it or understand it. It's got to be. It's got to be, because otherwise, where'd you come from? You didn't float down from. You're not. You know what I mean?
I recall a Meister Eckhart quote where he said that the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me.
Right, right, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're embedded in a system that's not just a physical system, it's a mental and physical system, because if we grant ourselves that, we have to grant it to everything, because otherwise how do we account for ourselves? We can't. And so we're part of that system, so it's a mistake. It's a mistake to abstract yourself from it. And I think that honestly, I think that abstracting ourselves from it has been dangerous. And if you look at like the state of the world and politics, you know, um, you abstract yourself from the world, you abstract yourself from this reality that is the world that's not just physical, but it's mental. And you imagine yourself as like some kind of God, and I feel that you lose touch with with what matters, and it becomes possible for you to embrace
I think certain kinds of violence become
destruction,
possible. Yes.
violence and destruction.
Yes.
Exactly, become possible.
Of course, there are cases where there are people that have various conditions, very deep depression and so forth, where harming the self is
Mm.
possible. But in general, with most people and most organisms, self-harm is basically impossible. But if we saw
Right.
everything as a part of the
Correct.
self,
There you go. Yeah,
you couldn't.
exactly.
How could
Yeah.
you hurt? How could you harm yourself
Right, right, right.
and change
Yeah,
everything?
because there would be no you without the context,
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
is all part of it. Yeah, and so I think that that's like just a basic like recognition of kind of reality, or like an appreciation for like existence, which is like a beautiful thing, and there's a kind of love in that, but when you abstract yourself from it, you kind of like deny that beauty, and you deny that type of energy and involvement and love, and you deny it, and it's not a life impulse anymore. So, or you lose that like affirmation of life. You know what I mean? And to me, it's more of an embrace of like nothingness, or death, or in power. I think is a way of, I've heard someone say that the opposite of love is actually power, and that to me makes sense in that context. The exertion of power over some part of reality is a denial of reality. And it's a denial, like you said, of yourself. Um, and then there's just no love. There's no love in it.
To me, fear is the opposite of love. Two
Mhm.
sides of the same coin, but power is merely an extension of fear.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
You're afraid, so you want to grasp on. Oh, I'm afraid of
Right,
die. I'm
right,
afraid
right.
of death, so I gotta do
Right,
everything I
right,
can to
right.
become more secure. And
Right,
this
right,
will,
right.
but you can't. You can't. You're denying you're denying nature. You're
Right.
denying the
And that's
reality.
what's so and that's what's so nice about and that's what's so interesting too about the Derek Parfit thing with like, ditching personal identity is it does really mitigate like the fear of death. It really does then because like what matters now is like is more like this connection into this like a larger network and and worrying about like what's going to happen to your like future self doesn't matter as much because the network and the connections are what matters and not this idea of yourself is really just an abstraction. You know what I mean? It's an abstraction, and it can make you feel closer to other people too. Like it kind of what it kind of does is it kind of uh it kind of breaks down, I think, some of the barriers between individual persons. You know what I mean? It breaks down because you kind of have different like things in this network you could pay attention to at a certain time, but the difference between one individual and another individual is much less because it's a matter of connections. It's not that we have these floating like discrete cells, which we really don't. That's just an abstraction.
I've been more interested lately in pantheism or what's
Yeah.
another word? I think did we talk about this last time?
I don't know. But that's yeah, so that's basically what I ended up calling this. Like you could call it like panpsychism.
Panpsychism, yes.
Panpsychism is like a philosophical movement that's like pretty similar to what I'm, I guess advocating. But I ended up going with I like the term animism. I like the term animism, because it's so old, and I do actually think that this way of thinking where we abstract ourselves from reality and we posit this like independent free floating self that's not really real but because we wanted to be free, right? We wanted to be free. We didn't want to have these encumbrances, these connections and encumbrances. We want to be free. And I think that is a relatively new thing in human history. I think it really shows up probably around like the agricultural revolution. You know what I mean?
I think so
And I
too.
think and I
Yeah.
think humans have been around for like 1 to 3, like a million years. And it never occurred to us to like abstract ourselves from our environment until the agricultural revolution or around then. You know what I mean? Because now we can have more food than we needed. We could have more food than we needed. And that's a strange idea when you think about it. There's a freedom in that, right? Because now I'm free of the world. I'm free of the world. That's it. But that's an illusion because when you're free of the world, you actually have nothing. You've created an emptiness. So yes, you've freed yourself from the world, on the one hand, good for you, and then maybe feels good. It's like a sugar high or something. There's power in that, a certain kind of power, but it's an empty position. It's an empty position, and so it creates a crisis. And I think that's the crisis of modernity. And I think modernity goes back a little further. I would date it back a little further than people usually would, but I would date it the agricultural revolution. And I think that's the
Right.
crisis of modernity is this feeling of emptiness that results when you abstract yourself from really the source of meaning. I guess the meaning of life. You abstract yourself from it, and nothing can mean anything then. It really can't. And so we struggle then to fill up that emptiness with something. And I think that is why we need art. I think that's why we need art because we have this damage. We have this rip between the mind and the body, and we know that we need to heal it. And in our society, um, art, and I do think in particular painting actually can show us, how that harm could be repaired, that how that separation could be undone. You know what I mean? So I don't think we would necessarily need painting if we were like, hunter-gatherers.
I agree. I
But
totally
we
agree.
need it. We really
I
need it now.
agree.
We really need
Yeah.
it now. It's like an antidote. We really need it. We really need it now.
A small example of that, my friend who lives in LA was saying that he had a theory that less interesting art happens in LA compared to New York because LA is already beautiful and there's flowers
Oh, because LA is already
everywhere and
beautiful. Yeah, that's so
yeah.
funny.
Yeah, but I think there is a lot of truth to what you're saying is that in the culture, like why do we need it? Why is art not just painting, all kinds of art? It seems to be some of the deepest expressions of what it means to be human.
Yeah, we need help. We need help in repairing this, damage that we've done to ourselves, that
Yeah.
as a group of organisms going back, a few thousand years. We need help. But I do think painting, and I listen, I really, really, really am interested in painting, but I like art in general. I like all forms of art very much. I do. But I do think painting is sort of well, I just think painting is well positioned. I think painting is just, in terms of what it is, a painting is, in the history of it too. But I just think it's almost uniquely well positioned to kind of address this idea of erasing the distinction between mind and body, as a form. I think painting is well positioned to do that. And we touched on one of the reasons in part one, but the other of our podcast, go back and listen to part one. But the other reason I think has to do with the form of painting. So if you and I think okay, so I think any physical object, right? Like this thermos I have here or anything is also a mind, but it's harder for us to see it, or it's harder for us to accept it. There's just certain experiences in life or certain kinds of things that are easier for us to understand are the unity of mind and body. You know what I mean? Although it's true of everything, but it's easier for us to grasp onto it in certain things.
Do you think that painting is a portal in that way?
Painting is like a way of, yeah, painting is like, ooh, that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah, painting is like a portal. Painting is like a way, painting especially, I think, is a way to kind of like show us this truth. And then ideally, once you've absorbed the truth, you could maybe start to apply it to more generally or more broadly, you know what I mean? But painting, but at least you have that, but at least, you know what, if nothing else, you can at least get that experience of the unification in mind and body, at least when you're with the painting. And that's better than never having it, for sure. You know what I
And you
mean?
feel it when you're making a painting.
Oh my God. Absolutely. Yeah. When you're making it, yeah. Or when you're looking, yeah. And I don't know about you, but for me, there's almost no relationship between, like, I remember, like, that show I have up now, I look at those paintings and um I remember working on them and I remember
Mhm.
what it was like to work on them. But in terms of like what they are now, how they turned out, like I don't recognize them at all. They're completely their own persons. You know what I mean? They're completely their own persons. And to me, they feel, to me, they seem to have nothing to do with me at all. And I'm like, I feel that I'm just as fascinated and surprised to see them as anyone would be walking in there. Even though I have memories of making them, but that doesn't seem connected to what they ended up being. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I just want to say this about the form of painting because I think it's so interesting because it's so simple, right? Like, what is a painting? Well, we know what a painting is, right? If you say painting, it's like kind of a flattish thing that usually goes on a wall. And it doesn't have to, like Donna Nelson, my teacher, takes off the wall, but it's still a flattish type thing that we know would historically probably go on the wall. Even though Donna and others have taken it off the wall. But yeah, so we have this kind of like somewhat of an idea of what a painting is, just has a form, like a schematic idea in our head, right? And I do think okay. So anyway, I think there's a connection between, mind versus body and also subject versus object. I think that those two distinctions are, if not the same, are at least closely related. They're the same kind of dichotomy. You know what I mean? And so when I say subject versus object, I could mean like the subjective point of view, like my point of view versus, your point of view, versus like an objective point of view would be, some kind of like neutral perspective about the way reality is in general, which is probably not attainable, but we could say, well, there's intersubjectivity. So like we put
Mhm.
all the subjective point of view together. That's our objective point of view. But then also there's just, more basically like the view of something as an, like grammatically, like the subject of the sentence versus the object of the verb. We have subject and object like that, the thing doing the action and then the thing receiving the action. Um, but I think that distinction between subject and object, I do think there is something there that I think at bottom, I kind of suspect that at bottom it's almost the same thing as this mind-body distinction. I think this distinction shows up in lots of different ways in our language and all over the place. So anyway, so if you're like going through life and looking at things, walking around, checking things out, you'll notice that you can like look up and down. You have like dimensions of space that you travel through, right? So you can look up and down as far as is comfortable for you, and you kind of see what's above you and down, and look up and down, and left and right too. And that's two dimensions. You got up, down, left, right. That's two dimensions of space, right? And those kind of arrive to me, I think, just perceptually, those kind of arrive to your mind pretty automatically. You don't have to like think about it. You know what I mean? But the third dimension of space, um, I think requires some kind of a is like an inference. It's like an inference. So for example, and I'm talking about the depth, how far away something is from you. That's like a mental inference compared to the up, down, and left, right. So for instance, it could be the like we're familiar with images that we know are two-dimensional, but have the illusion of being three-dimensional. You know what I mean? So it could be the case that all of reality is actually two-dimensional, and it could look exactly the same to us. We wouldn't necessarily know the difference if like we happen to live in a universe that actually only had two dimensions. That could be the same experience we're getting right now. But and everything that we perceive as the third dimension like depth could just be this like illusion that's created within the two dimensions. Does that make sense? Like that could be the case. But depth, positing this third dimension of depth is a convenient way for us to explain phenomena that happens, but it's not necessary. It's not a necessary it's not necessary that we have that third dimension. Everything that happens could be happening, and we perceive it exactly the same way if we only had these two dimensions, you know. But when I see like a tree, I see it kind of flat, up, down, and left, right. But if it's curving around, I kind of imagine that there's something back there, but I don't really know. I don't really
Is
know.
this kind of why you're thinking that painting uses a
Yeah,
unique form?
yeah, exactly. And so because I think painting actually is kind of like so that is kind of like our subjective experience in terms of these dimensions of space.
Mhm.
And I think painting is kind of like a model. Painting is like a model of that subjective experience. Because what is a painting? A painting is you can look at a painting up and down and left and right until you get to the end of the painting. And that would kind of like be like a s analogous to like the limits of like your field of vision, right? Whatever's comfortable for you to look up and down. But then the third dimension of painting is separated. It's separated from the first two, up, down, and left, right, because it's radically abbreviated. The depth of the painting is radically abbreviated, and that's what makes it a painting. Is the fact that its third dimension, its depth dimension, is so much less than the other two, right? If the third dimension of a painting approached the extension of the other two, it would be a box. We wouldn't think of it as even if we painted it, we wouldn't really call that a painting. We'd call it a box with like something painted on one of the faces. Does that make sense? Like,
Mm.
it'd be like a sculpture or something. And so I think that just the form of painting showing that difference between the depth dimension and the other two dimensions is kind of like a model, is actually kind of a model of how we subjectively experience the world, you know?
Does it have to be
But
a painting versus like a flat image or a photograph or a poster or something like that?
yeah, because it still has depth.
Yeah.
Because it still has depth, and those things don't. Not much. And that also gets into image versus object, which is the other reason why painting is so especially well suited for this mind-body thing. But yeah, so the painting is a model of the way we subjectively experience the dimensions of space, but at the same time we recognize that it's an object. So it's a model of our subjectivity, and at the same time it's an object. So it's subject and object at once. And to me, that is the form of it is subject and object at once, which is not controversial, I don't think, although maybe it's not obvious. But then so that is because by virtue of being subject and object at once in that way, it kind of is in a good position to be mind and body at once too. Because I do think there's a connection between subject, object, and mind body.
Perhaps that's part of the reason why I feel like it slows down consciousness or it precipitates questioning.
A painting does.
Yeah, painting seems to be just a generally just healthy for the consciousness to think about painting, to perceive painting, to do painting.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think so. I mean, I think because of that, I mean, so the way I usually think about it is that it's like a kind of a person. And like I said, really everything probably could be, but something that we recognize as being at once subject and object. or at once mind and body, that is almost, I think, what is important about being a person. You know what I mean? Once if we are able to recognize that this thing has a subjective point of view in the same time that it's an object, then we grant it like personhood. And we do that for paintings. We do that for paintings. So when you're encountering a painting, you're encountering a kind of a person, and I do think there's a seriousness in that or a depth in that, and I do think it requires a certain kind of engagement in a certain kind of time and it hopefully promotes it, if the painting holds your attention, hopefully promotes it. And so that's what the thing with the door, I just wanted to, you want to kind of find a way to slow down to actively engage with these people, these paintings, these persons, to actively engage, to choose, to physically engage with that space. And so you have to open the door. You have to physically have embodied volition, embodied like will. I'm opening the door and I'm engaging myself as a mind and as a body with this space. And the paintings, once you have a show, the paintings and the space are kind of the same thing. They work together as an artwork. They have to.
It was important, though, that was specifically your door. That specificity to you seems to be important, right?
Yeah, I like that door. Right. So to me, I mean, it could be, right, it could be any door, right? But then this door is special. This door,
This
because
is the
this is
door
my, yeah,
that
this
led
is the
to these
door.
paintings,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
these
yeah. This door
specific
has a
paintings.
history. Yeah, this door has a history. So to be an arbitrary door, and and in general, we talked about specificity last time. And in general, you know, I am kind of like I'm not worried, but I arbitrariness is sort of the enemy of specificity. You know what I mean? And so we don't want to just be pulling things, because for some reason, because there's always a reason. So if you pull something down, what's the reason? It's going to be because it's going to be some kind of like design reason or because it looks good or something. And now you're abstracting yourself from reality. You know what I mean? So it can't be arbitrary. It's got to be specific to keep yourself embedded in what matters in reality.
That's good.
Does that make
That's
sense?
good.
Yeah,
It makes a lot of sense.
the arbitrariness, and there's an arbitrary flavor to like bombing a country for no reason. I mean, there's the arbitrariness is kind of the enemy of specificity.
It is. And also it's the enemy of love. I think we also,
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely,
yeah,
100%.
yeah,
Yep.
we nailed that down last time that we saw in part one we discussed
Good
how
job. Yeah.
specific yeah, it's all coming back. It was important. We had to do that. We laid the framework for this.
hmm
And it is true that specificity is really an extension, an expression of love, you would say. I asked you why those Northern Renaissance paintings were
Yeah.
special. What is it about those? And you
Yeah.
said specificity, and I really come to see that's true. And interestingly, I've been reading this book, Northern Renaissance Art by Susie Nash. It's just so good. She talks about,
Mm.
I didn't realize this, the most of what we're seeing, I mean, we're only seeing a tiny slice of what survived.
Oh my
A
God.
lot was,
Really?
yeah, they
Wait,
said,
wait. It survived, but we don't see it. Where is it then?
oh, it's just destroyed. Yeah, there was
Oh,
a
so it didn't
piece
survive. It didn't
didn't
survive.
survive.
I
We're
see.
only seeing
I
a little
see.
bit
Yeah.
of what
What
we're
was
only seeing a little
made?
bit of what was made.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
most of it's been destroyed through various like the in
Wars.
1566 wars. There was a
Wars.
wave of iconoclasm happening in 1566,
Oh, of
they
course.
said that the
Yes.
bonfires in Belgium where you could see them from 10 miles away from the
Oh.
burning art.
Now, and that is because of religion.
Yeah,
And don't you think, though, that it is interesting? Because to prepare for this interview, or this podcast, I read my own stuff because I don't remember a lot of what I thought. Because my thinking has, as I've gotten older and just more and more interested really in painting, the older I get and the more I paint, I just get more and more interested in it. And I do think that my way of thinking has become like embedded into paint and I'm no longer as fluent with words as a result. I'm not. But when I was younger, I really was. So I had to go back and see what were my words, so I can talk. But eventually I just wouldn't be able to talk. It'd be like having a podcast like with a tree is my hope. And that's what you should do. You could do a podcast with a tree. That's my goal is to be like a tree, and you do the podcast with a tree. The thing I
the
saw in
tree
here was
cast.
about, yeah, because you do it with different trees, right? Today's oak tree, the next time we got a different tree.
It'd have to be like a time lapse. We'd have to sit. I'd have to sit there with it for like a
With the
good
tree,
like a
yeah, I
number
think
of
that would be.
days.
I honestly think that would be an incredible project because especially if you got different trees. But I was thinking about religion with art, and I was thinking about you because I know that you're very interested in Northern Renaissance for whatever reason. And isn't a lot of that artwork funded by the church or motivated by religious concerns on the point of from the perspective of the artist?
Yes.
Of course, it's
Yes.
devout. It's devout art.
But
Or,
interesting, there was so much commerce involved. I thought it was more funded by the church, but it wasn't really. It seems like there was
mm.
many wealthy patrons. Actually, I think something like 25% of Memlings that they found records of were
And
to
what
Spanish clients,
in
and
what
it was
church?
fashionable, I think,
Is this
to
Catholic
have
Church?
this would have been the Catholic Church. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but I don't think it's so I've thought about that, and I really don't think it's a coincidence. I really don't think it's a coincidence that Catholicism in particular has in Western, of course, in Western art, has been associated with so much great uh artwork in the Western world, Catholicism in particular. I don't think it's a coincidence because I kind of think that if you have this culture where this distinction has been drawn between mind and body, and there's an enervation that results in that, and a loss of meaning, a loss of connectedness. But Catholicism, to me, is almost like an ersatz animism. It's like a poor man's animism because you have in Catholicism, you have these physical structures on like the smoky thing that they wave around and the outfits. You have all these physical things that are imbued with all this meaning. You know what I mean? So it's almost kind of like if you're gonna have this mind body distinction, but Catholicism is kind of like hinting a little bit towards it's like the most animist of the mind body split, like cultural traditions. Does that make sense? Because they
Absolutely.
have all
Yeah.
this stuff. They have all this stuff.
What's embedded in the objects then,
The
and
objects, yeah,
they've
the
taken it from
valuation of the
nature.
objects, the
They've
valuation of the
taken
objects.
yes,
Yeah,
yes, they've taken it from nature and they put it in the objects. And you
they
see
put it
that
in the objects. Yeah,
perhaps it
yeah.
reached its pinnacle in the 15th century
Right, right, right.
with Van Eyck and with Memling and those people, and because there was so much the amount of craft, the level of
Yeah,
craft was just so
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
extreme.
yeah, yeah. So
So
those
yeah,
people, those people were used to that idea that the object, like an icon. I
yes,
love the idea of an icon painting. You pray to the painting. It makes perfect sense. But those people were used to that idea that this object could be a spiritual thing. And I think they
yes,
took it pretty literally. I
I
think they
think
took
they
it
did
pretty
too.
literally. I think they literally would pray to that icon painting or to the little devotional picture. I love so much the Duccio painting at the Met with the little candle marks at the bottom. It's so good. And the candle marks make it better. You know what I
Kills
mean?
me.
Because they were
They
praying to
love
that
those
and
things.
they literally loved it. Yeah, as an object, but it was not just an object to them. It was an object that was a spiritual being,
Yeah,
you
they would
know?
take these paintings and parade them in the town square. There's a lot of
Yes,
like,
yes, yes,
I don't
yes,
know,
yes.
I wouldn't even call it damage. I would just say there's a lot of like marks from people
Right.
touching it, from
Yeah,
people
yeah,
love they
yeah. People
love
touching
these,
it,
these
and that's part
objects.
of the art, right? And you kind of, and if it's, but that way of thinking is actually kind of what you need,
I think it is.
to be an artist, right? And so for them, they kind of got at it in this kind of like circuitous, like backwards way because they're Catholics, but they ended up in a pretty decent place for
Yeah,
thinking about an object in like mental terms, or taking it seriously, taking an object really, really seriously. And it's actually hard to do, but you have to be really interested in this piece of wood. Look at this piece of wood or this paint, which is like nothing, but to be really interested in it. And that's what you have to do. And it's not that easy, For
that's really,
us, it's not that
yeah.
easy.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of do you know the Santo Daime tradition, what that is in Brazil?
No.
It's like a version of ayahuasca.
Oh, interesting.
They
Yeah.
were doing it in South America, and the only way they could actually do the medicine is by weaving Catholic traditions into it.
Oh, right,
So,
right, right. To
you know,
to
you
to clear the boss, the
yeah, it's
authorities
for
and
the
stuff. Yeah.
authorities.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So you see the way in which a lot of these animist traditions, yeah, you call
Yeah,
it that,
yeah, 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 yeah.
had to weave like
Absolutely.
Catholic,
Yeah.
and perhaps it's the same with Northern Renaissance paintings that you have this
Yeah,
real
yeah.
veneration of the object, of the materials, of the paint,
Right, right,
of the
right.
wood, everything. Just
They almost
a
ended
real,
up there in spite of
yeah,
themselves, in spite of
yeah,
themselves. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that is interesting. That does happen all over the place with the animist stuff being co-opted. Like in Ireland, there's these like druid shrines, like to the river or the spring, completely animist. And nowadays those exact same spots will have like a little Virgin Mary stuck in there and stuff because the Catholic Church just They didn't fight it. They just stuck this Catholicism on top of it,
Of
and that's how they
course.
got the people to go along with
Of
it,
course, of course. And you
Yeah,
see
yeah.
that in all the holidays too.
Yeah, yeah,
Christmas,
exactly,
Easter, it's all the
exactly.
solstice,
Christmas,
spring
it's
equinox,
all
of course.
ancient pagan holidays.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely, yeah.
because those are the essence of what it is to be human.
That's right. That's right. Bring
And
your tree inside. Yeah.
exactly. And then by taking, so I think in one's art, I think it's really important to think about these things, to think about how you can embody the essential qualities of what it means to be human
Yeah.
into your work and weave in that love and specificity. And to me, yes, that's kind of that's it's medicine. It's an antidote to
Mm,
a
yeah,
lot of the
yeah,
stuff
yeah.
we're seeing happening now.
But yeah, that's kind of the framework that I sort of developed for thinking of this like problem and solution is in terms of mind body, like we split it off and then how do we undo it? How do we undo that split?
I
Um
like the way that you think about painting as a healing process.
yeah, I mean I think at least in that moment, at least we have something, some piece of reality, to me. It seems like it should be very important.
Yeah, I hope painters listening to this will think about when they paint, embedding a kind of healing touch in their work.
It's just involvement, For me, it's just involvement, Like that's what's going to make it like specific and worthwhile is the level of your involvement, and it's sort of easier said than done. And I think that for me, and I think different people sort of need different things, but I kind of think that for me, I think that's kind of why. I was talking about the paint and being so interested in the paint. And it's easy to say, like, oh, and I've said this myself, I'm gonna follow the materials because the materials are already in mind and I just follow them and that's good enough. And that's true, but that's a little bit easier said than done, right? Because when you see the materials or you see the paint, how do you know that you're following the materials and not just some kind of like projection of yourself? You know, it could be yourself that you're following and you're just tricking yourself that you so how do you stay actually close and actually stay interested in the materials themselves and like really regard reality and value reality, this like quote unquote dumb reality, dumb objects? How do you actually see them? How do you actually access the paint? How do you actually access an object and actually take it seriously and actually regard it seriously? It's not that easy to do. And so for me, I think that's part of why I keep occasionally I will, feel the need to approach painting from a new angle and make a landscape painting. Or I make these different kinds of paintings. I'll approach painting in different ways, and I think and it's not conscious, but I think that for me, what that's probably kind of about is 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 not taking the material or the process for granted, and like by seeing it by approaching it in a way that I haven't done before, or maybe hadn't thought of before, or haven't experienced before. I can kind of see it. I can kind of see it, or I can kind of like regard it, or I can kind of have access to it again, because after a while, if you do the same, for me anyway, you do the same thing that you did before, you have the same kind of, we all have our habits, our processes and stuff. And then in a while, you're seeing or what you're interacting with is your own habit. You're interacting with what's the word? Your own like structure that you already set up.
Your own
And
proclivities,
yeah,
perhaps.
your own proclivities, your own structures that you set up. That's what you're interacting with, and there's a layer between you and the thing. So you need to find a way. It has to be, I think, a relatively active process to find a way to get around yourself, to get to the painting. You know what I mean? To get around your own history and everything.
Yeah, and then full circle back to Derek Parfit. It seems like
Mm.
this is the way that you've taken to deflate the self and diffuse the ego, and so that you can actually see things more clearly.
Um, Derek Parfit. Yeah, exactly. So exactly, yeah, because Derek Parfit is saying like, oh, this is a benefit is that we can like actually you know, reduce the boundaries between ourselves and other people. But for me, it's I'm regarding, paint and painting and objects as a kind of a person, as things that have mental states. And so I'm hopefully reducing the boundaries between myself and these objects. Seeing myself as more of an object, seeing objects more as mental states.
And instead of saying, I'm Jonathan, I make this kind of painting, you're going to make a
Right.
painting that is something that you wouldn't normally make, but you're able to change your relationship with what you're producing as an artist. You still have the product, but then
Right.
it's not really the product in the same way. For me, that was so refreshing about the show, and I
The
really
product, yeah, exactly.
it
Emphasis
be,
for me is not the product. Yeah, that's true.
yeah, it was really about the experience. And I had a moment there where I was looking back and forth at the one. And so you're looking at the differences. You try to find the things that are in common, that are different, and then you start to notice things too about like certain qualities of the paint, the texture, the color,
Hmm.
that you notice different things because of the different perspective. And I think everything really is relational in that way. Alan Watts I think he's often talked about this about figure and ground. There's
Mm.
only up because there's down. There's only black because there's white.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the context is the whole thing. Yeah.
It's all about context.
Yeah, the context is the whole thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and for me, I don't know, is it just I guess different people are different. You had my teacher Donna on here before, and I really loved the podcast you did. But she is someone who seems she's very unusual. Well, she's a very unusual artist and unusual person, but she seems to almost have like a built-in capacity to stay connected to material. I don't know that but she's also someone who has changed her work, changed her approach to her work periodically many times in her career. So maybe it's not as different as I think, but I think of her as or when she talks and stuff, she seems almost like effortlessly able to maintain that connection. And for me, I feel like it's something that I have to maybe more actively safeguard or stay in touch with some way. I don't know. Yeah. But that's an impressive thing about her. Yeah.
Completely impressive. And she's almost 80 and
Right,
she's
right,
still
right.
saying she's like just now kind of figuring things out a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
I
that's
love that
important. That's important. Yeah. I mean, it has to be
she
that way,
stayed
right?
open. Yeah,
It
it
has to
has to
be
be.
that way because otherwise it's death. I really think
Yeah.
that like you have to there's life is change and development, you
Yes.
know. And stasis is not life, it's death, I think.
I really enjoy that she threw everything away from the 1970s, a whole decade of
Hmm.
work.
Yeah, yeah.
She had to do it because it was weighing her down, she was saying. And most of us wouldn't dream of doing that because we hang on to these things we've made because we associate them with ourselves.
That's right. Well, that's the mistake. That's the mistake is associate with yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's not about you. It's not
There's no
about you.
continual self.
It's not about you at all. Yeah, exactly. It's not about you. Because I mean, to me, myself is just not that interesting. It's
Same.
really
Yeah,
not. It's
yeah. I'm
really
like,
not.
what am I going to
Yeah.
do with these old? And I've
Yeah.
unstretched and repainted so many paintings and used the old, and I still have many more that now that's inspiring me to get rid of even more stuff from the past.
Yeah. And I think that, and I do think that's like the whole signature style thing too. It's like a promotion of the self or like a selling of the self. What you buy then is that you buy this little piece of this self and that's considered valuable because this person is famous or she was
And they're
a
finite, right?
genius. Yeah, she was a
Yeah.
genius or something. And so we can have a piece of this self and that's what we're buying. But really, I think that, and I don't actually think, I don't actually think that it really matters, but I do think that this idea of signature style is connected to sort of a more abstracted notion of the self, like something that Derek Parfit would attack. I do think it's pretty clear that it's connected to that. But I also think it has to do with your historical context. And so I do think there were different periods in history where that notion of a self kind of made more sense or was more tenable given that historical moment that you were in. And so a lot of the great artists of like the mid-century with like strong signature styles, I think in those days, like in the culture, that idea of a self, I don't think it was any more true then than it is now, but I think it was more tenable. That idea of this like abstracted self was more tenable given the culture then than it is now. Even though it wasn't
Yeah.
true then, it was maybe more tenable then when you look at like the state of the world and like, even politics and how things worked, that it made a little bit more sense then. I don't think it was true then, but it made more sense then. And now to me, it just doesn't really make sense. It doesn't
Think
anymore.
about the way in which we're seeing that consciousness is truly not localized.
But those notions of the self and signature styles related to it, they're culturally contingent too, right? So like
Context.
In
Yeah.
ancient Chinese art, the whole point is to make something that is indistinguishable from what the master 500 years ago made. And so you're not supposed to be able to tell them apart. You're not supposed to because no one in that culture, no one believes in personal expression. It's not important. It's not a value. It's not a cultural value that they have. You know what I mean? And the paintings are incredible. They're incredible, but like good luck telling them apart, and they can be made hundreds of years apart. You can't. You have to count the rocks. I took an ancient Chinese art history class in college, and it was ridiculous because on the test in those days they had slides, right? And you'd have the exam was they'd project it, and you'd have to identify it, and you're literally counting the rocks as ink paintings. You're literally counting the rocks because they you cannot tell them apart. And you're not supposed to be able. That's not the point. That is not the point of that artwork. That is not considered an expression of individuality. Individuality was just not a cultural value that they had. It just wasn't important to them. You know what I mean?
So, what is the art of the future? What does it look like to be an artist in a world in which we stop identifying with the self?
Oh wow, what a good question. The art of the future. Well, I guess the art we're all aren't we? I think that we must be all. We're all. Don't we all think that we're making the art of the future? You know? Don't don't we think that? I mean, I think you kind of have to think that. You kind of have to think that. But I think just in general, I just think in general that the future, just in general, will probably have to be at some point more localized than what the way we see things now and less abstracted, you know. And I do think that contexts for us are easier to understand and inhabit when they're more localized, you know, and smaller. Like for instance, you can only know, I don't know if you've heard this, but it's like you can actually only know like 100 people or 120 people. If you meet more people than that, you have to forget some of the others. And that's the size of like a wedding. You know what I mean? And I don't think it's a coincidence. And I just think that we're kind of like I think we're getting to the point where we've kind of like exhausted what we can do with like
Oh, yeah, Dunbar's number.
project. Yeah, is that what it is? Yeah, projecting.
Hmm.
We've projected upwards from like, and those would be like the size of like a tribe, you know.
150 people. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be the size of your tribe. That's who you know, and that's your tribe, you know. But I think we've kind of gotten, I think it feels to me like we've approached the limits of what we can do, abstracting upward from those original tribes that we have. Like, our tribe has gotten more and more abstract, and it's gotten so abstract that it's like sort of seems to me that's self-destructing, you know. And so I sort of imagine that the future will probably have to be uh we'll probably some of that will probably collapse. It'll end up being more local, you know.
You'll make art that
Maybe we'll all have
is more relevant
our
to your
own
tribe.
masterpieces. Yeah, we'll have our own
Yeah.
masterpieces or more
Yeah.
of them, or you know, I
And there'll
don't
be
know, but I think that
exchange,
would be good.
some exchange between tribes, but you might be
Right, right,
the tribe,
right.
the artist of the tribe. And I remember feeling very satisfied in high school that I was kind of like the tribal artist of the high school. You know,
What does that mean?
I won best
Really?
artist of the high school. Yeah,
Oh, of the high
my
school.
senior year. So I kind of like
Congratulations.
had
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had a sense of, but I knew you. It's like you kind of know where you fit in. You're doing these
Right. Yeah,
things,
yeah, it's true. Yeah, yeah.
you know. So I think I agree with you. I think it's
And you
not.
want to break
Yeah.
free of your context. So you want like bigger and better and like break free, right? But then if the artwork is really great, it kind of brings you back to something more intimate and smaller. You know, it's kind of like it's very similar, I think, to what we said about specificity. You know, like the more specific it is, that it actually becomes more universal because we all want to do one thing. We all want to be that thing or experience that thing. And if you can do that, then that applies to everyone kind of in a way, you know. So I think that's another thing about art too, is that like it can like transcend these like boundaries and barriers and stuff, but then it brings us when you're actually looking at it, it brings you down into more into something that's more personal, more intimate, more meaningful to you on like a even like on a social level, you know. So yeah, so I don't know about the art of the future. I guess the right answer is you're supposed to say something about like technology. That's what you're
No,
supposed to say, but
I
I
think you're right.
don't think in terms of technology. I really don't. To me, technology is just a thing, you know.
Yeah, and I like that you don't have a smartphone, and I think that's probably
I don't have a
part of
smartphone.
the reason
Yeah.
why you're able to accomplish so much thinking
Oh
and
my
really,
God.
you know.
Yeah.
But I think I just want to say one thing. I
Okay.
think you're absolutely right about that. I think the art. I don't want to say necessarily of the future, but the when you're really in touch with it, is something that is deeply personal
Yeah.
and something that is imbued with love.
Yeah, I agree. I think so too. I think so too. And it maybe sounds a little hokey or something, but I think those are the things that matter. You know,
It is on a
those
deeper
are
level.
that's what matters to us. Yeah.
Whether you're articulating them with language or not, you
Right,
feel
right, right.
them. You feel them when you see them in a painting, you know.
Yeah.
So we just took a quick break so I could show you some paintings in the studio, most of which are based on historical paintings of the Annunciation, and you mentioned the painter Munch.
I'm super interested in Munch. Everything about him, the way that, everything about the paintings is so good. But sometimes with Munch, and not all the time, but sometimes when he's got these figures, the figures kind of take me out of the painting, and it's particularly the faces. And I just think there's something about rendering a face that you recognize like as a figure, as a depiction of a human in a painting that makes it very hard to relate that to the rest of the painting, like the space and the marks and all that type of stuff. It's psychologically just a very different type of thing. You know what
I
I mean?
couldn't do it. You know, I
It's
tried
yeah, and so it
and
doesn't
I just did
surprise
not
me.
work out.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me to see that you just left the faces off because that's kind of a good solution. It's kind of a good way out of it because once the face is in, it's very hard to fit that idea of a face. A face is so important to us. The face of the face of a loved one or whatever, of a person and the microscopic distances between the eyes. Like we calculate that stuff in a split second.
Yes.
I mean, it's a huge deal to us. Again, it really is important because you have to, for survival, you have to recognize
Yes.
your family and your friends and stuff so that someone doesn't eat you or whatever or kill you. But yeah, there's something about that, the faces in those Mook paintings that I even wrote something about it.
They throw
But
you out of it.
take me out of it. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to see that you did that because it doesn't, and that's something that I haven't really done. Well, I've painted myself a couple times, but the figure is something I haven't really tackled, and I don't even know that it's something that I even have that in me. But I think that would be really, really tough, is the face. The
I
idea of a
never
face.
imagined. Yeah. And the nice thing about these paintings is that I'm like interpreting them as interdimensional entities
Right.
as
Yeah.
opposed
There's
to
not
leave them
they're
open.
not individuals,
No,
right? So they don't necessarily even need
they're really
faces.
ideas,
Yeah, their ideas, yeah.
anthropomorphized ideas.
So they should really be, extensions of this depicted space that they're in. They should be extensions of that space. They're kind of like agglomerations or something of that space, like a
Of the
little
architecture,
node, yeah, of a
yes.
little node of the architecture, you know what I mean? And so they're kind of there to kind of like activate the architecture, and they're kind of activated by the architecture. And so it's not the same as like encountering an individual who's like your loved one or your enemy or something like that. So you kind of don't really want to get into that. So leaving the face off, I think makes a lot of
I'm
sense.
glad you say that. I hadn't really thought about them as part of the architecture, but they
Oh,
really are.
totally,
And
totally, yeah, totally.
I think I mentioned to you that I went and saw Brahms' Requiem at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine a couple weeks ago. It really transports you. You're transported being in that space, but
Oh,
I
for
was thinking
sure.
about
That's
the
an incredible
music.
space.
My
Yeah.
God. And the
And Brahms is
music.
so good. Yeah.
Oh, this is
So
just,
good.
it's so
Did you
deep.
have the Furt Wangler recording of
Yeah,
it?
it's good. It's
He's the
really good.
Brahms, he's the
Yeah,
Brahms
yeah.
guy.
I listened to the Furt Wangler Symphony Number 3 by Beethoven, the one you
Oh
mentioned.
yeah, yeah.
It's good. It's
Eroica.
really
Yeah,
good. Eroica.
it's incredible. Yeah.
That piece, I think it's perfect. If there was a piece that was perfect to me,
The Third Symphony you like?
yeah,
It's
it
pretty
just
good. Yeah, it's hard to argue hard to argue with Beethoven. There's something about those,
uh,
but like the Von Karajan, I have all the Beethoven symphonies,
yeah,
like it's not
yeah.
expensive. And there's something about those because like now, I don't know, what your take on it is or your awareness of it, but there's kind of like a movement or like maybe like a fad for like period instrumentation. Period
They
instrumentation. So
use the harpsichord,
yeah,
right?
the
And all,
harpsichord
yeah.
and the type of even violins have changed.
Really
Oh yeah,
interesting.
it's all
To
changed, and they're not. And so there's a movement where you should record the piece with the instruments that would have been available at the time that it would have been like first performed or when the piece was written. It's a way of things. It's like a philosophical. It's a big like debate, in the classical
Interesting.
music world.
Interesting. Yeah.
But I want to say is I have both. I have like for Beethoven, I have a complete set of period instrumentation. And I mean, the instruments are just quieter. they're quieter,
Mm.
and the period instruments are quieter. They're quieter, and they're more delicate, And it's very, very, very interesting, though. It's very interesting. But then with the Von Karajan, it's like mid-century. It's huge. The sound is huge because he doesn't. He does not care about period instrumentations. He's using modern instruments, and they're big. They're big. Like the sound is just big and powerful, and it's like it blows your skull, it blows the top of your skull off. But there's something to be said for both. It's really, really worth listening to Beethoven both ways
I
because it's
will.
totally different. It's totally
Thanks for
different
the tip on
experience.
that. If you have
And
any recordings, send me. Yeah.
they're both, yeah,
Yeah.
I can tell you, yeah, so Von Karajan, so compare Von Karajan to
What's a new one?
John Elliott Gardner
I
is
have
the
listened to
guy.
that. I
So
have listened to Gardner. Yeah. So he does.
he's the
He has
period
a really
instrument guy.
beautiful Messiah.
Oh yeah, but you compare those two, and it's like you wouldn't even almost recognize it as the same piece.
Interesting. Well,
You
think
know what I
about the way
mean?
that mediums have changed too throughout history. I think a lot about like what painters were using, how sensitive, and they're grinding up lapis lazuli to
Oh
make
right, right, right,
pigments,
right, right, right,
and
right, right,
it's a
right.
different thing. And now I get this bright, just powerful color acrylic
Oh,
thing.
of
Like
course, yeah.
just
Well, the organic pigments and stuff, they're newer,
versus
and they are more
synthetic. Yeah,
they're stronger. Yep, for
yeah,
sure. They're more
yeah.
concentrated. But that is such an interesting thing about music is that the art is actually the performance. I mean,
It's truly living.
the writing of it is clearly important. But like my friend was like, "Oh, you really like Bach." I have a friend who's a musician. He's like, "You really like Bach," and I'm like, do I really like Bach? Like, I don't even know if I do, but I really like Glenn Gould playing Bach for sure. I'm a huge Glenn Gould fan, and I don't know if I like Bach because
God,
I could hear
God
someone
Himself
else.
performed it.
Yeah, exactly. I can hear someone else playing
Yeah,
Bach, and it doesn't do much for me. It really
yeah.
doesn't. So I don't know that it would be accurate to say I like Bach, but I love Glenn Gould. It's the performance of it that makes the art. You know what I mean? So with Beethoven, you could have totally different art experiences. There's kind of no well, it's like we were saying, there is no Beethoven. It's just the context. There's no such thing as Beethoven. It's the context is the art. The context is the art.
Yes, exactly. I saw a version of the Messiah at Trinity Church, and I saw it at the Philharmonic, and it was vastly
Right.
different,
Totally
vastly different.
different.
But the one at
I'm
Trinity
sure.
was just electric.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, I'll
yeah.
go again next year. You should come with. It's they do my friend who I went with is a music
Hmm.
aficionado. I would he's an amazing musician, and he
Yeah,
was
yeah,
saying that it's humane because it's only an hour and 15 minutes versus
yeah.
two and a half hours. He called
Yeah,
it
right,
humane,
right.
but
The
he was just
humane version.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was blown away by it though. He was
Oh,
like
I'm
that was he
sure.
was like
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
the best
yeah.
one I ever saw. And the
Oh,
Trinity
wow, wow,
version,
wow. Yeah, but it makes a huge difference, like the building, and a huge difference. Yeah,
building, the
huge difference.
acoustics,
It's part of it.
everything.
It's part
It's
of
a
it. Yeah.
living thing, but
Yeah,
also
absolutely. Yeah.
everything, you really have to think about context. And I think that's in nuance. And I
That's the
think
thing. That's the thing.
Parfit really was I think he's sort of hinting at this when he talks about the shades of that identity is not a simple yes no. And now I'm tapping back into ChatGPT,
Right.
the psychological continuity issue that Parfit talks about, that it can be a matter of degree. Everything is a
Well,
matter of degree, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So he makes the distinction between psychological continuity and psychological like connectedness, which would be like a closer relation. But
Hmm.
what's so interesting is he's like you can well, he's a philosopher, so he like
So he's
invents
saying what
all
matters
kinds of
is
stuff.
the psychological connections, not the idea of continuity.
Well, no, they both matter, but they like you said, they matter in different degrees. And
Hmm.
so they both can be important to you. But because what can matter can be a matter of degree, which clearly is true, then identity must not be the arbiter of what matters, because identity is not a matter of degree. Identity can't be. It's black or white. It's yes or no. You know what I mean? And so that's why we have to toss identity. But he's like we can remember something. He's like there's no reason why we can't remember something and not know whether it was our memory or someone else's memory. In principle, we could have a memory, and we could then decide, okay, was this my memory or is this a memory of a different person? And it might be a person that like inhabited your same body at an earlier time before you had a break in psychological continuity, and you have that memory. But then it might be a person in a different body, and this is why you can have a connection between, you break down the difference between yourself and someone else. You know what I mean? And you might actually have more in common with a stranger than you have with an earlier version of yourself. that person's life might be more important to you, or you might be more to you mentally than yourself at certain points in your life. Why not? Why not?
I had an experience on ayahuasca one time where
Uh-huh.
I thought somebody else's thoughts.
Hmm.
And then
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
knew that I was
Why
like
not?
that consciousness bled into mine because I was open in them. It was so open.
Right, right,
And
right.
that was a really intense one. I got really like triple dosed, double dosed by this shaman. And it was like
Jesus.
kind of
Yeah.
irresponsible. Like there's people flipping out and
Yeah, yeah.
this guy it was screaming going on, just wild.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
but in that moment, it was like, you know, the dust from a moth, like the on its wings.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
I
yeah,
realized
yeah.
that that's actually how tenuous life is. It's that
Yeah,
precious.
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
that fine and tenuous,
Right,
and
right.
it's that tenuous. It's like a little thread, and you just blow on it, and it just disappears. You
Right,
know, and
right,
I just
right.
realized how beautiful. And then at one point, somebody was like breathing with me, and I felt
Uh-huh.
so alive. It was like being
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the womb in the tribe. You know, it was just
Uh-huh.
such a.
Yeah,
I mean, then when I woke up the next day, or when I came to, or whatever, I mean, there's no sleeping going
yeah.
on. I had like
Right.
vomit all over my clothes, and I'm just like,
Disgusting. Yeah.
what even happened? But it was so beautiful because it actually was probably closer. It was probably some of the closest, the most clear I've ever actually seen things
Right,
for
right,
what
right,
they
right.
really are. You're seeing
Yeah.
things for what they actually
That
are.
can be helpful. Yeah. That can be
And
helpful.
so just in the same way that you know, like if you can get outside of yourself, I think art can do that.
Yeah, yeah,
Art
yeah.
can just for the briefest of moments, just for a split second, it can change your
Right.
consciousness and put you in the consciousness of somebody who made that painting thousands of years ago, hundreds of years, but
Or
whatever it is
the consciousness of the painting itself,
of the
which I think
painting.
is separate from
Ah,
the person who made it.
indeed.
I think it has to be, right? It
Yeah.
has to be. If it's any good.
The
Like
thing
it's
itself
because it's like yeah, because it's like not like Donna said something that it was really true. Like it's not enough for the painting to be good. And this really rung a bell with me. It's not enough for the painting to be good. It has to be inevitable like a tree. Like I can't, she said, I can't criticize the tree outside my window and say like it shouldn't have grown that way. That branch shouldn't be there. You can't critique a tree. And that's how the painting has to be. It has to be that inevitable. And for me, that is like saying it's its own person. And that's the way I would express it. I would say that it has to be as inevitable as a tree or as a person. It has to, to regard it as a kind of a person, which means it cannot be an extension of the person who made it. In a way, it has to be it actually, I think in many ways has almost nothing to do with the person who made it, other than like that's just the historical contingency that led to it coming into the world. You know what I mean? But once it's here, it's its own person, just like you're your own person and you happen to have the ancestors you have, but I don't evaluate you based on your ancestors. Like that's part of who
yeah
you are. That's part of who
yeah
you are. But my experience of you isn't because of something your grandfather did.
I think that's absolutely true, but you can't force that. Then it becomes a product.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah. No,
You
that's
know,
true.
that
Yeah.
inevitability has to be.
You have to follow it. You have to follow it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it has
Yeah.
to be
For me, it's
followed.
kind of like a
Yeah.
funnel. I feel like I'm in a funnel. And I start the painting and I'm like at the top of the funnel and you start working on it. But as you work on it, it becomes more and more inevitable and you just are trapped in this funnel and it's leading to this point. And at a certain point, it doesn't matter what you do to the painting. You know it's going to that point anyway at the end of
You
the
just
funnel.
follow it. That's good.
Yeah, you just get
That's
sucked
good.
down to the bottom and then that's it. And then
That's a
it's
beautiful thing.
out of your hands. It's out of your hands. That's how I feel. Yeah.
That's great. Oh man, Jonathan, it's been there's a lot to think about here.
Thank you so much.
I think that there's going to be a part three on the horizon.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's my goal is like Sherazade, to compel more parts
Yeah,
each
well,
time.
no, it's a living this too. This conversation is a living thing, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
and it
yeah.
changes the way you think. And I think having these conversations about art is really important. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, I appreciate it too. You're so good at it too, and it's so rare, isn't it? So rare. It's so rare to like sit and talk seriously about painting and like what's important. Isn't that very rare? I feel like
It's very rare.
We don't do that. It's not. I don't do it too much.
We should
So
do it more. I mean, I think
yeah, I think
we
so.
don't do
Yeah.
that because it's difficult, and we also
It
another
is
reason.
difficult.
Yeah,
It is difficult. And then you have to use words too, which is hard. But that's another thing I've always been very inspired with Donna. She like really accepts that challenge of like using words to talk about painting, which you almost can't do. But her example has made me see it as kind of like a very interesting like challenge and puzzle. And I do think it can actually be helpful, to just
yes,
really to make that attempt to really wrestle with it and see what can I say about it? It's interesting. To me, it's interesting. Yeah.
me too. And I think it really does change the way you think
Yeah.
by stretching yourself like this and getting outside of your comfort zone and thinking about things less as a product and to get more invested in the process, not
Yeah,
just
and
a, yeah,
talking is a process, can be
it's
a
a process,
process,
part of the
like a
process.
dialogue. A
Yeah.
dialogue, yeah, can be like a
Yeah.
generative process. So anyway,
Exactly.
thanks for the
Yeah, thanks.
opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for
I
coming on.
really
And
appreciate it. Yeah.
people should see your show at James Fuentes.
Well, I
When
think
is that
that
up till?
April 4th is the last day.
So they should see it. April 4th is the last day. It's an amazing show. And before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thanks. Thanks, for the time. I appreciate it and the interest and the, the willingness to think and talk. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.
All right, thank you.
Talk soon.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.